There is a version of you that you have decided you are not. You have looked at it, at some point, maybe only for a second, and you have said, quietly, to no one, that is not me. Not the anger, not the need for attention, not the jealousy, the fear, the hunger for approval, the desire to be seen as more than you currently believe yourself to be. You have built, over years, a picture of who you are. A picture that feels true, a picture you can live inside comfortably, and most of the time it holds. But then something happens, a comment, a tone of voice, a person walking into a room and taking up more space than you think they deserve, and for a moment something rises in you that does not match the picture. You feel it before you can name it. A flash of heat behind the eyes, a tightening in the chest, a thought that arrives faster than you can stop it, and that you would never say out loud, because it does not sound like something you would think. You tell yourself it was nothing, a bad mood, a long day, an overreaction that does not reflect who you actually are, and you believe that, mostly, because the alternative is uncomfortable. The alternative is this: what if that reaction was not a mistake? What if it was not noise, not static, not some meaningless glitch in an otherwise stable identity? What if it was a message arriving from somewhere in you that you have spent years learning not to listen to? You say, I am not an angry person, and then someone speaks to you a certain way, and something in you goes cold and sharp, and for a few seconds you are someone you do not recognize. You say, I don't care what people think of me, and then you find yourself replaying a conversation from 3 days ago, turning one sentence over and over, trying to work out what a person you barely know actually meant by it. You say, I am completely independent. I don't need anyone's approval. And then a message goes unanswered for a few hours longer than expected, and a small, familiar unease begins to move through you. One you would never admit to, one you barely admit to yourself. You say, I have moved past that part of my life, I've dealt with it, and then a single, small reminder, a song, a smell, a familiar street, and something in you reacts as though no time has passed at all. None of this makes you dishonest. It makes you human, but it also raises a question that is easy to avoid and difficult to sit with once you have actually heard it. If these reactions do not belong to the person you believe yourself to be, then whose are they? Somewhere underneath the version of you that you have practiced, that you have come to believe is simply who you are, there may be another version. Older, in some ways, less polished, less concerned with being liked, admired, or approved of. A version you have spent a long time convincing yourself does not exist, or at least does not belong to you. And here is the strange part. The part that makes this worth sitting with, even if it is uncomfortable. The parts of yourself you refuse to look at do not simply disappear because you have refused to look at them. They do not evaporate because you have decided they are beneath you or beneath the person you want to be. Instead, they tend to do something quieter and in some ways more unsettling. They continue operating just outside the reach of your attention, shaping the way you react to certain people, certain situations, certain kinds of criticism in ways you cannot easily explain, because you have never allowed yourself to look directly at where those reactions come from. This audiobook is an exploration of that possibility. Not a diagnosis, not a verdict, an exploration. It draws on the psychological work of Carl Jung, who spent much of his life studying the parts of the human mind that operate outside of conscious awareness, and the ways those hidden parts continue to influence behavior, mood, and relationships, whether a person acknowledges them or not. Jung did not believe that the unconscious parts of a person were simply dangerous or evil or something to be feared and suppressed further. He believed they were something closer to unfinished, undeveloped, denied a place in the story a person tells about who they are, and therefore forced to express themselves sideways through reactions that seem to come from nowhere. You may not think of yourself as someone with a hidden side. Most people don't, That is, in a strange way, exactly the point. The parts of you that are the most hidden are usually not hidden because you examined them and rejected them consciously. They are hidden because you never had a reason to look at them in the first place. They were simply excluded, quietly, over years, as you built the version of yourself that could function, that could be loved, that could belong. So before this goes any further, here is the only thing worth holding on to for now. Somewhere inside you, there may be a person you have spent your whole life pretending not to be. Not a villain, not a secret criminal, not something to be ashamed of in the way you might currently imagine. Simply a part of you that has been waiting, quietly, for you to stop looking away. And the uncomfortable possibility, the one this audiobook will explore slowly and carefully, is this: that person may still be influencing you. Right now, in ways you have not yet learned to see. Fafi, the person you learned to be long before you had the language to describe it, you were already learning who you were allowed to be. Not through lectures, not through anyone sitting you down and explaining the rules. You learned the way most people learn the deepest things, through repetition, through consequence, through the small, constant feedback of the world around you responding to different versions of yourself in different ways. You smiled, and you were rewarded with warmth. You cried, and something in the room shifted, tension appeared, and you learned, without knowing you were learning it, that this particular reaction cost you something. You were curious, and someone found it charming. You were curious a different way, at a different time, and someone found it exhausting. Slowly, without any single dramatic moment, you began to notice which parts of you were welcomed and which parts of you made people uncomfortable or disappointed or distant. And, because you needed those people, because your survival, both physical and emotional, depended on their approval and their closeness, you began to do what any intelligent, adaptive creature would do. You adjusted. You kept the parts of yourself that were met with love, or at least with acceptance, and you began, quietly and without ceremony, to put away the parts that were not. This is how what Jung called the persona begins to form. The persona is not a lie. It is worth saying that clearly, because it is easy to hear the word and assume it means a mask, a performance, something false hiding something true underneath. That is not quite accurate. The persona is closer to a translation. It is the version of you that is comprehensible to the outside world. It is the self you present so that you can function within a family, a friendship, a workplace, a culture that has its own rules about what is acceptable and what is not. Maybe your persona became pleasant, easy to be around. Someone who smooths things over, who does not cause friction, who can be relied upon to keep the peace. Maybe it became competent, someone who has it together, someone other people come to for answers, not someone who needs help themselves. Maybe it became quiet, undemanding, low maintenance. A person who does not take up too much space, does not ask for too much, does not need too much. Maybe it became strong, the one who copes, the one who does not fall apart, even when falling apart would be an entirely reasonable response to what is happening. None of these are false selves. They are real. They developed for real reasons, in response to a real world that responded to you in particular ways. Think about how specific this process actually was for you. Perhaps you grew up in a home where one parent's mood dictated the emotional temperature of every room, and you learned, very young, to read that mood accurately and adjust yourself accordingly before anyone had to ask. That reading and adjusting did not stay confined to childhood. It became a template, quietly applied to every subsequent relationship, every workplace, every room you have entered since. Perhaps you were the child who achieved, the one whose report cards and accomplishments became a source of family pride, even family stability, in ways that were never explicitly stated but were nonetheless deeply felt. Achievement became fused with belonging, so thoroughly that even now rest can feel like risk, and a period without visible progress can feel like a quiet threat to your place in the people around you. Perhaps you were the child who kept the peace between two people who could not keep it themselves, absorbing tension that was never yours to hold, translating between two perspectives that refused to translate themselves. You may have become, without ever choosing the role directly, the person everyone still comes to when something needs smoothing over. These are not abstract patterns. They are the specific architecture of a specific persona, built under specific conditions for reasons that made complete sense at the time. The problem is not that the persona exists. The problem begins when the persona stops feeling like a version of you and starts feeling like the entirety of you. Because a persona, no matter how useful, is always partial. It is built for a specific function, a specific set of relationships, a specific set of expectations. It was never designed to contain everything you are. It was designed to contain what was acceptable, what was useful, what kept you safe and connected within a particular environment, which means that anything outside of it, by definition, had to go somewhere. There is an important nuance here that is easy to miss, especially because the word persona can carry a slightly negative connotation, as though wearing one makes you somehow less genuine than a person who supposedly wears no mask at all. No one goes through life without a persona. It is not a flaw unique to certain people while others remain purely, unfilteredly themselves. Every person who has ever navigated a family, a school, a workplace, a friendship, has developed some version of an adapted self, some collection of traits emphasized and traits minimized, in response to what that particular environment rewarded and what it punished. The persona exists because human beings are social animals, and social animals cannot survive, let alone thrive, by presenting every internal state indiscriminately, at every moment, regardless of context. A degree of adaptation is not dishonesty. It is simply what it means to live among other people. The difficulty is not that you have a persona. The difficulty arises when the persona becomes so thoroughly identified with, so completely mistaken for the whole of who you are, that anything falling outside its boundaries begins to feel like a threat rather than simply an unexpressed part of a larger self. This tends to happen gradually, almost invisibly, because the persona typically forms in response to genuine necessity. A child who learns to be quiet in a chaotic household is not making an error. They are adapting intelligently to their circumstances, finding a way to remain safe and connected within a specific environment. The trouble is not the original adaptation. The trouble is that the adaptation, useful as it once was, tends to outlive the circumstances that made it necessary, continuing to shape behavior decades later. In situations where the original threat no longer exists, and where the excluded traits might now be entirely welcome, if only they had been given room to develop. Consider, for a moment, the shape of your own persona, not in abstract terms, but in specific ones. If you had to describe yourself in 5 words, the words other people would likely use, or the words you yourself reach for automatically when asked, what would they be? Reliable, calm, independent, kind, successful. Now consider the opposite of each of those words: unreliable, volatile, needy, selfish, unremarkable, or worse. Somewhere in you, is there a fear of becoming those things? A fear so old and so quiet that you rarely think of it directly, but that nonetheless shapes how hard you work to remain exactly the opposite. That fear rarely announces itself as fear. It tends to disguise itself as preference, as personality, as simply who you are. I'm just not an unreliable person. I've never really been the volatile type. These statements can be entirely true, but it is worth noticing how quickly they arrive, how automatically, and whether that speed says something about a genuine absence of the trait, or about a trait that was excluded so early and so completely that its absence now feels like identity rather than choice. This is not a flaw in you. It is simply how identity is built for almost everyone. You cannot become anything without simultaneously deciding what you are not. Every persona is defined as much by what it excludes as by what it includes. But here is the part that matters most, and the part that this audiobook will return to again and again. The traits you exclude from your identity do not stop existing simply because you have excluded them. They go somewhere. They do not vanish the way a deleted file vanishes from a screen. They move underground into a part of you that continues to exist, continues to feel, continues to want things, even though your conscious identity no longer claims them as its own. The calm person still gets angry somewhere. The selfless person still wants something for themselves somewhere. The confident person still doubts somewhere. And that somewhere has a name. Jung called it the shadow. Before this goes any further, it is worth sitting with a simple, honest question, not to answer it immediately, but to let it settle. What would you never allow yourself to become? Not because you are incapable of it, but because it does not fit the person you have decided you are. Hold that question loosely for now. It will matter more than you expect. Carve the shadow you keep denying. Imagine, for a moment, a house. Not a metaphor you need to work hard to picture. Just an ordinary house, the kind you might actually live in. Now imagine that this house has more rooms than the ones you use. Rooms you walked past so many times, so early in your life, that you eventually stopped noticing they were there at all. Not because they were locked. Not because anyone forbade you from entering them. Simply because, somewhere along the way, you decided, or it was decided for you, that those rooms did not belong to the house you wanted to live in. This is one way to think about what Jung called the shadow. Not a monster, not a demon waiting behind a door. Simply the collection of rooms in yourself that you no longer visit, no longer furnish, no longer think of as part of your home. To understand why these rooms went unvisited in the first place, it helps to understand what Jung meant by the ego. The ego in this framework is not the inflated, self-important thing the word often means in everyday speech. It refers simply to the center of your conscious identity, the part of you that says I, that experiences itself as the author of your thoughts and choices, that holds together the story of who you believe yourself to be from one day to the next. The ego's task, in a sense, is to maintain coherence. It wants a self-image that makes sense, that fits together, that can be presented to the world and to yourself without constant contradiction. And because coherence is easier to maintain with a narrower range of material, the ego tends to favor traits that fit smoothly into the existing story while pushing away traits that would complicate it. This is not a flaw unique to you. It is simply how a conscious identity forms in a limited mind that cannot hold everything about itself in view at once. The ego chooses a story, and the shadow becomes everything the story left out. The shadow is often misunderstood in casual conversation as something purely negative. The bad side, the evil twin, the version of you that would do terrible things if it were ever released. That is not what Jung meant, and it is not what this audiobook means either. The shadow is better understood simply as everything about you that your conscious identity has not made room for. And that includes far more than cruelty or rage. It can include your anger, yes, but it can also include your ambition, your sensuality, your need to be admired, your desire to be the center of attention just once without apologizing for it, your grief still unspoken, your competitiveness, your softness, if you were taught that softness was weakness, your strength, if you were taught that strength in you specifically was somehow inappropriate, or threatening, or unbecoming. The shadow contains whatever did not fit, and what did not fit was not decided by some objective standard of right and wrong. It was decided by the particular family you grew up in, the particular culture that surrounded you, the particular relationships that taught you, early and repeatedly, which parts of you were safe to show and which parts were not. Consider anger. If you were raised in an environment where anger, especially your anger, was met with punishment, withdrawal, or humiliation, you likely learned to disconnect from it entirely. not to manage it, not to express it differently. To disconnect from it so thoroughly that you may now describe yourself, honestly, as someone who simply does not get angry. And yet, certain situations still produce something in you, a tightness, a coldness, a sharpness in your voice that surprises even you. You may call it frustration, because frustration feels more acceptable than anger. You may call it being tired, or stressed, or having a lot going on. Anything but anger, because anger was never given a place to live inside the identity you built. The anger did not disappear when you disowned it. It moved into the shadow, and from there, it still finds ways to surface, usually in moments you did not choose, expressed in ways you would not have chosen either, because it was never allowed to develop a mature, conscious form of expression. It only ever learned to exist in hiding. Now consider ambition. If you were raised in an environment that valued humility above almost everything else, where wanting things too visibly was treated as arrogance, where standing out was quietly discouraged even as achievement was praised, you may have learned to disown your own ambition. You may now describe yourself as someone who doesn't care about status, doesn't need recognition, is simply happy doing good work quietly. And yet, you notice, more than you would like to admit, when someone less experienced than you receives credit you feel you deserved. You feel something sharp and uncomfortable when a peer is promoted before you. You tell yourself it doesn't matter, because admitting that it matters would mean admitting to an ambition you have spent years pretending not to have. The ambition did not disappear. It moved into the shadow, where it now expresses itself as comparison, as quiet resentment, as a discomfort you cannot quite name, because you were never permitted to name the thing underneath it. Consider one more example, because it tends to be among the most common and the most fiercely denied. The need for approval. If you were raised in an environment where independence was prized above almost everything else, where needing others was quietly equated with weakness, you may have learned to present yourself as entirely self-contained. You do not need reassurance. You do not need to be told you did well. You do not need anyone's validation because you have your own. And yet, you notice, with a discomfort you rarely name out loud, how much a single unanswered message can occupy your thoughts. You notice how carefully you track the tone of an email, searching for signs of approval or its absence. You notice a small, private satisfaction when someone praises your work, a satisfaction that feels disproportionate to how little you tell yourself their opinion should actually matter. The need for approval did not disappear because you decided it was unbecoming. It went into the shadow, where it now expresses itself as an unspoken hypervigilance toward how others perceive you, dressed up as independence, but functioning underneath as one of the most persistent unmet needs a person can carry. This is the pattern worth understanding because it repeats endlessly across almost every trait a person might disown. Jealousy in someone who believes they are above comparison. Vulnerability in someone who has built an identity entirely around emotional strength. The need for approval in someone who insists, often loudly, that they need no one's approval but their own. None of these traits vanish through denial. They simply lose their conscious form. They stop being something you can look at, evaluate, and choose how to express. Instead, they become something that acts through you, in moments when your guard is down, in reactions that feel disproportionate to whatever triggered them, in patterns you repeat without understanding why. There is another dimension to the shadow that is easy to miss, because it does not involve traits you find shameful. It involves traits you were never permitted to develop at all. Confidence, for instance, can become part of the shadow not because you did something wrong with it, but because you were taught, early and consistently, that confidence in you specifically was unwelcome. Perhaps a sibling was the confident one, and there was no room for two. Perhaps confidence in a child was read as disrespect, and was corrected accordingly. Whatever the cause, the result is the same, A capacity that might have developed naturally instead went underground, unused, unfamiliar, so that even now, decades later, ordinary self-assurance can feel oddly foreign, even threatening, when you try to access it. Creativity can suffer a similar fate when a family or culture prized practicality above imagination, and a child's inclination toward art or ideas or play was gently but persistently redirected towards something more useful. Assertiveness can disappear the same way when a child learns that agreeableness is the price of belonging, and that having needs of one's own, stated plainly, is somehow a burden to others. There is also a quieter form the shadow can take, one that has nothing to do with dramatic emotion at all. It can involve something as ordinary as rest. If you were raised in a household where worth was measured almost entirely by productivity, where stillness was treated with suspicion, where a person lying on the couch in the middle of the day was seen as lazy rather than simply tired, you may have absorbed a belief that rest itself is something to be earned, justified, or apologized for. Decades later, you may find yourself unable to relax without a nagging sense that you should be doing something else, a restlessness that has nothing to do with genuine energy and everything to do with an old, unexamined rule about what makes a person acceptable. The capacity for rest did not disappear. It became part of what you exclude from your identity, so thoroughly that even now, choosing to do nothing can feel less like self-care and more like a small act of rebellion against a voice you inherited long before you had any say in the matter. Consider, too, the shadow that forms around receiving rather than giving. Some people learn, early and specifically, that their value comes from what they provide to others: comfort, help, advice, a listening ear. This can become such a central part of identity that receiving the same things in return begins to feel deeply uncomfortable, almost intolerable. Offered support, they deflect it. Offered praise, they minimize it. Offered care, they find a reason to redirect the conversation back toward someone else's needs. This is not humility, though it often gets mistaken for it, even by the person doing it. It is frequently a sign that the capacity to receive, to be cared for without immediately reciprocating, was never given permission to develop. That capacity did not vanish. It moved into the shadow, where it now expresses itself as a subtle, persistent inability to simply accept something good without earning it first. It is also worth noticing that what gets pushed into the shadow is never universal. It is shaped entirely by the specific values of the specific environment that raised you. In a family that prized emotional restraint, sensitivity became shadow. In a family that prized emotional openness above all else, an instinct toward privacy or self-containment might become shadow instead, treated as coldness rather than as a legitimate need for internal space. In a culture that prized individual achievement, cooperation and interdependence might be quietly devalued. In a culture that prized collective harmony, individual ambition might be the trait pushed furthest out of view. This means there is no universal shadow, no single list of traits that everyone represses in the same way. Your shadow is a precise negative imprint of the specific values you were raised inside, which is part of why examining it requires looking honestly at your own particular history, rather than assuming your excluded traits will match anyone else's. It is worth being clear about something that runs through every example so far. The shadow is not assembled once, in early childhood, and then left permanently fixed for the rest of a person's life. It continues forming, quietly, across every stage of life. Whenever a feeling or trait is met with enough discomfort, rejection, or punishment that disowning it feels safer than keeping it. A difficult breakup can teach a person to disown their need for closeness. A humiliating failure at work can teach a person to disown their ambition. A friendship that ended badly after one honest disagreement can teach a person to disown their willingness to disagree at all. The shadow, in this sense, is not a fixed inheritance from childhood alone. It is a living record of everything you have ever decided, consciously or not, was too costly to keep. None of this is meant to suggest blame toward yourself or toward anyone who raised you. Most people did not consciously decide to suppress a child's ambition or confidence or anger. They were usually responding the only way they knew how, shaped by their own shadows, their own excluded rooms, passed down without anyone intending harm. What matters now is not where the exclusion came from. What matters is recognizing that it happened, and that whatever was excluded did not simply cease to exist. It is still there, still part of you, waiting in the rooms you stopped visiting, for you to notice that the house is larger than the part of it you have been living in. It is worth pausing to state something plainly, because it is easy to lose sight of in a discussion that keeps circling back to anger, jealousy, and resentment. Unconscious does not mean harmful. Something can live outside your awareness and still be entirely benign, even valuable, simply waiting for acknowledgement rather than waiting to cause damage. Not every excluded room contains something uncomfortable. Some of them contain a capacity for joy you were taught to keep quiet, a talent you were told was impractical, a softness you decided, somewhere along the way, was not worth the risk of showing. The shadow is not a synonym for danger. It is simply a synonym for unseen. The shadow, understood this way, is not something to fear. It is something to become curious about. Because the moment you begin asking what might be living in those unvisited rooms, rather than assuming the doors should stay closed forever, something in you begins to shift. Not dramatically, not all at once, but quietly, the way most real change happens. You begin to wonder what else might be true about you, beyond the story you have been telling. And that wondering, uncomfortable as it can be, is the beginning of something Jung considered essential to psychological maturity. Not the elimination of the shadow, the acknowledgement of it. 5AY certain people get under your skin. There is a particular kind of irritation that feels different from ordinary annoyance. Ordinary annoyance passes. Someone is late, and you are mildly frustrated, and then the moment ends and you move on with your day, barely remembering it an hour later. But there is another kind of reaction, one that lingers, one that seems disproportionate to whatever caused it, one that you find yourself thinking about hours later, replaying, rehearsing what you should have said, feeling the same heat rise in you again just from the memory. You may have someone in your life like this. A colleague, a relative, a person you barely know, encountered once at a party, who nonetheless occupies more of your mental space afterward than the interaction seemed to warrant. Something about them gets under your skin in a way that other, objectively more difficult people do not. Jung offered a framework for thinking about this, one of his more well-known and more genuinely useful ideas. He called it projection. Projection describes a psychological process in which a quality you have difficulty acknowledging in yourself appears to you as though it belongs entirely to someone else, and often appears there in an exaggerated, almost theatrical form. It is worth being precise about what this does and does not mean, because projection is easy to misuse as a blunt accusation. It does not mean that everyone who irritates you is secretly a mirror of your worst qualities. It does not mean that every dislike is really self-hatred in disguise. People can behave badly, and your reaction to bad behavior can simply be an accurate, proportionate response to bad behavior. What projection describes is something more specific, a reaction that feels unusually intense, unusually personal, unusually difficult to let go of, especially when the trait involved is something you have specifically excluded from your own identity. Consider the person who cannot tolerate arrogance in others, who feels a genuine surge of contempt whenever someone speaks with too much confidence, too much certainty, too much visible self-regard. This reaction might simply reflect good judgment about an unpleasant trait, or it might reflect something else. A person who has learned, somewhere along the way, that their own confidence was unwelcome, unsafe, or inappropriate, and who has therefore worked hard to remain modest, careful, and self-effacing. When they encounter someone freely expressing the very confidence they have suppressed in themselves, something old and uncomfortable stirs. Not simple disapproval, but something closer to threat, as though the other person's ease with themselves is a quiet accusation against the years spent making yourself smaller. The intensity is the clue, not the presence of the reaction, but its disproportion. Consider someone who cannot stand attention-seeking behavior in others, who feels visible disdain toward people who post frequently online, who speak often about their own accomplishments, who seem to want to be noticed. Sometimes this is simply taste or values and nothing more. But sometimes underneath that disdain is a person who wanted to be noticed too, who wanted attention as a child and did not receive enough of it, or received the message that wanting it was shameful, that needing to be seen was a character flaw rather than a basic human need. That person may have built an entire identity around not needing attention, around being content in the background, and every person who visibly, unapologetically seeks attention becomes, without either party realizing it, a living reminder of a need that was never allowed to be met honestly. Consider someone who is deeply uncomfortable around emotionally expressive people, who feels a kind of second-hand embarrassment when someone cries easily or expresses excitement loudly or lets their feelings show without editing them first. This too can simply be a difference in temperament. But it can also point towards someone who learned early that emotional expression was dangerous or excessive or a burden to others, and who therefore built a very controlled, very composed persona, one that prizes restraint above almost everything else. Watching someone else feel freely, without apparent shame, can trigger something complicated. Not just discomfort, but a kind of grief, for the version of themselves that never got to feel that freely either. None of these examples are universal truths. They are patterns worth considering, not conclusions to apply automatically to every irritation you feel. It is worth pausing here to add an important caution, because this idea, once encountered, has a tendency to be applied too broadly in a way that stops being useful and starts becoming a kind of parlor trick, turned on every dislike a person has ever felt. Not every irritation is projection. Some people are genuinely inconsiderate, genuinely dishonest, genuinely difficult to be around, and recognizing this clearly is not a psychological failure requiring further self-examination. There is a real difference between disliking someone because they have repeatedly broken your trust, and disliking someone because they remind you, in some indirect way, of a quality you have not made peace within yourself. The first is simply an accurate response to real behavior, treating it as though it must be projection, as though every negative judgment secretly reveals more about you than about the other person, can become its own kind of avoidance, a way of failing to hold other people accountable for genuinely harmful behavior. The distinction, again, tends to come down to intensity and persistence rather than the mere presence of a negative reaction. A reasonable, proportionate dislike of someone's genuinely harmful behavior tends to feel relatively settled, relatively clear, and does not usually consume disproportionate mental space once the interaction has ended. A reaction rooted partly in projection tends to feel stickier, harder to let go of, prone to resurfacing unexpectedly, and often carries a charge that seems slightly out of proportion to what actually happened. The useful question is not, what does this person's behavior say about them? The useful question is, why does this particular behavior affect me this strongly, when other, arguably worse behavior does not affect me nearly as much? That question, asked honestly, tends to lead somewhere interesting, not always toward projection. Sometimes the answer really is simply that the behavior is genuinely harmful and your reaction is appropriate and proportionate. But sometimes, if you sit with the discomfort a little longer than usual, you find something underneath it that surprises you. A longing you had not admitted to, a trait you had quietly decided was forbidden to you, a version of yourself you had stopped imagining as possible. This is worth pausing on because it changes the entire tone of the exercise. Projection, understood this way, is not primarily a tool for judging other people more harshly. It is a tool for understanding yourself more completely. When a reaction feels unusually large, unusually personal, unusually sticky, it can become an invitation, not an accusation. An invitation to ask, gently, what does this person have access to that I have decided I am not allowed to have access to as well? Sometimes the answer is uncomfortable. You might discover that the confident colleague you cannot stand has access to a self. Assurance you were taught to distrust in yourself. You might discover that the attention-seeking acquaintance you privately mock has access to a desire to be seen that you buried so deeply you forgot it was ever there. You might discover that the emotionally expressive friend who embarrasses you has access to a freedom with feeling that you gave up somewhere along the way, in exchange for being seen as composed, capable, and unbothered. There is a practical way to test whether a strong reaction is worth this kind of examination, and it involves something simple: how long the feeling lingers, and how often the same person or type of person produces it. A single moment of irritation, forgotten by evening, rarely needs this level of scrutiny. But a reaction that returns again and again toward a particular kind of person, arrogant people, needy people, people who seem too sure of themselves, people who seem too unsure, is worth treating as a recurring signal rather than a series of unrelated coincidences. Recurrence is the clue that something structural is happening, something that has less to do with any single individual and more to do with a pattern you carry into every room you enter. This does not mean you need to become like them. Projection is not a demand that you adopt every trait you have disowned, without discernment, without judgment. It is simply an invitation to notice, honestly, what has been excluded, and to ask whether the exclusion still serves you, or whether it has simply become a habit you never examined. There is a quieter version of this same dynamic that is worth mentioning as well, because it does not involve irritation at all. It involves admiration. Sometimes you feel an outsized, almost uncomfortable fascination with someone. Not dislike, but a kind of pull, a curiosity that borders on envy, toward a person who seems to embody a quality you wish you had more access to. This too is a form of the same process. The qualities you admire excessively in others are often qualities you have not yet given yourself full permission to develop. The freedom you envy in someone else is frequently a freedom you have not yet claimed for yourself. Consider someone who feels contempt toward people they perceive as weak, people who seem to give up easily, who complain rather than push through, who ask for accommodations rather than simply managing on their own. This contempt can sometimes reflect genuinely held values around effort and resilience, but it can also point toward a person who was never permitted to be weak themselves, who had to manage difficulty alone from a very young age, and for whom watching someone else receive the accommodation they never received produces something closer to old grief than simple judgment, grief that has hardened over time into contempt, because contempt is easier to tolerate than grief. Consider someone who reacts with unusual sharpness to highly ambitious people, people who talk openly about their goals, their 5-year plans, their drive to keep achieving more. Here again, the reaction might simply reflect a genuine values difference, a preference for a slower, less achievement-oriented way of living. But it can also point toward a person who once had ambitions of their own, ambitions that were discouraged, mocked, or quietly deprioritized in favor of more practical concerns, and who has since made peace with a smaller version of what they once wanted, a peace that is disturbed, uncomfortably, every time someone else's undimmed ambition walks into the room. There is a particular relationship where this dynamic tends to appear with unusual clarity, and it is worth naming directly because so many people recognize it instantly once it is described. The relationship between a parent and a child. Parents frequently find themselves reacting with surprising intensity to specific traits in their children, traits that seem to provoke a response far larger than the situation would seem to require. A child who is stubborn provokes fury in a parent who was never allowed to be stubborn themselves. A child who cries easily provokes impatience in a parent who was taught that crying was weakness. A child who is unusually confident, unusually loud, unusually certain of their own opinions, provokes a discomfort in a parent that has little to do with the child's actual behavior and everything to do with a version of confidence the parent was never permitted to develop. This does not mean every strict parent is simply projecting, or that every boundary set with a child is secretly about the parent's own shadow. Children genuinely need guidance, structure, and correction. But it is worth noticing honestly whether your reaction to a particular trait in someone younger than you carries an intensity that seems to exceed what ordinary parenting or mentoring would require. That excess intensity is often the clearest signal available. A similar dynamic frequently plays out in romantic relationships, though it tends to move in the opposite direction through attraction rather than irritation. People are often drawn, powerfully and somewhat inexplicably, to partners who freely express exactly the qualities they themselves have suppressed. The reserved, controlled person who falls for someone spontaneous and unpredictable. The dutiful, responsible person who is captivated by someone carefree, someone who seems to move through life without the weight of constant obligation. This attraction can feel, in its early stages, like falling for a missing piece, and in a sense, it often is. The qualities that draw you in are frequently qualities you recognize at some unconscious level as belonging to a part of yourself that never had room to grow. The trouble tends to arise later, when the very quality that first attracted you becomes the quality you find hardest to tolerate, precisely because it continues to remind you, day after day, of everything you disowned in yourself in order to become who you are. Both directions point toward the same underlying truth. The people who affect you most intensely, whether through irritation or admiration, are rarely neutral. They are often, in some way, connected to the parts of yourself you have not yet fully acknowledged. Not always. Not in every case. But often enough that the question is worth asking, especially the next time someone gets under your skin in a way that seems larger than the moment deserves. Instead of asking only what is wrong with them, it can be worth asking, quietly and without judgment, what is this reaction showing me about myself? When suppression starts controlling you, there is a difference between feeling something and expressing it, and there is a difference again between expressing it and being ruled by it. Most people understand this distinction in theory. Far fewer have actually examined how it plays out inside their own life, especially when it comes to the emotions and traits they have spent years trying not to feel at all. Suppression, at first, seems to work. That is precisely what makes it so convincing and so difficult to question later on. You decide, consciously or not, that a certain feeling is unacceptable. Anger, for instance. You notice it rising, and instead of allowing it to move through you and inform your response, you push it down, redirect it, talk yourself out of it, replace it with something more palatable. And in the moment, this often works. The anger recedes. The situation passes. You feel, if anything, a little proud of your composure. But feelings that are suppressed rather than processed do not disappear. They accumulate. Think of it less like turning off a switch and more like closing a door on something that is still very much alive on the other side. You can close that door 1,000 times. Each time it will seem to work. The room goes quiet, but nothing inside the room has actually changed. Whatever was in there when you closed the door is still in there, undiminished, sometimes intensified by the pressure of being contained. This is how suppressed anger eventually finds its way out, often in a moment that surprises everyone involved, including you. A person who insists they never get angry, who prides themselves on their calm, their patience, their ability to remain level-headed no matter what is said to them, will often experience a very particular kind of eruption, not a gradual escalation, the kind that comes from someone who is comfortable expressing frustration as it arises. Instead, something sudden, disproportionate, almost unrecognizable, even to themselves, a reaction to something relatively small that seems to draw on a reservoir of intensity far larger than the moment could explain. Afterward, there is often confusion, even shame. "That's not like me," they say. "I don't know what came over me." But in a sense, it was entirely like them. It was the part of them that had been closing that door again and again for years, finally reaching a point where the door could no longer hold. The anger that emerged in that moment was rarely only about the immediate trigger. It was the accumulated weight of every smaller anger that had been denied a voice along the way. This pattern repeats across nearly every emotion a person learns to suppress. Consider insecurity. Someone who has built an identity around competence, around having things together, around being the person others rely on rather than the person who needs support, often develops a deep discomfort with their own uncertainty, not because they never feel uncertain, everyone does, but because uncertainty does not fit the persona they have constructed, and so it gets pushed underground rather than acknowledged. The insecurity does not disappear. It reappears as something else, perhaps as a need for constant achievement, a restless inability to feel satisfied with what has already been accomplished, because satisfaction would mean sitting still long enough to notice the doubt underneath the striving. Perhaps as irritability toward people who seem less driven, less anxious, more at ease with themselves, because their ease is an unconscious reminder of a peace this person has not allowed themselves to feel. Perhaps as an inability to receive feedback without a disproportionate internal reaction, because any suggestion of imperfection threatens a structure that was never built to withstand doubt in the first place. Consider resentment. People who are taught, especially early in life, that their needs are secondary, that being agreeable and helpful is their primary value, often develop what looks from the outside like extraordinary generosity. They give freely. They rarely complain. They put others first consistently, sometimes to their own detriment. What often goes unspoken, even to themselves, is the resentment that accumulates underneath that generosity. Not because giving is inherently harmful, but because giving that is never balanced by receiving, that is never accompanied by an honest acknowledgement of one's own needs, tends to curdle over time into something quieter and more corrosive. This resentment rarely announces itself directly. It shows up as exhaustion that seems disproportionate to the task. It shows up as a sharpness in tone that surprises the person who felt it, a flash of irritation towards someone they were only trying to help. It shows up as a vague, persistent sense of being taken for granted, even in relationships where, on the surface, everything looks fine. The person experiencing this rarely connects it to its source, because doing so would mean acknowledging something that conflicts directly with their self-image. I am not the kind of person who resents helping others. And so the resentment stays unnamed, expressing itself sideways in moods and reactions that seem to come from nowhere. Consider the fear of appearing weak. For many people, especially those raised in environments where vulnerability was treated as a liability, an entire identity gets constructed around never appearing to struggle. This can look, from the outside, like remarkable strength, and in some ways it is, but strength that has no room for weakness is not the same as psychological wholeness. It is a persona doing exactly what personas do, protecting a person from an old fear by building a wall so high that even the person behind it forgets what it was originally protecting them from. The cost of this particular suppression tends to be loneliness, because a person who cannot show weakness cannot be fully known by anyone, including, in a strange way, themselves. Relationships remain at a certain depth and no further, not because the other person is unwilling to go deeper, but because vulnerability, the very thing that makes deep connection possible, has been quietly excluded from what this person considers acceptable to show. There is a further cost worth naming, one that surfaces specifically in moments when help is genuinely needed. A person who has spent years signaling, through every interaction, that they do not struggle, often finds that when a real crisis eventually arrives, as it does for everyone eventually, the people around them are caught off guard, unsure how to respond, sometimes even doubtful that the struggle is as serious as it actually is. The very persona built to protect against appearing weak can end up isolating a person precisely when support matters most, because no one around them was ever given a reason to expect that support might one day be needed. Consider the need to appear perfect. This suppression often takes the form of relentless self-criticism aimed outward, at situations and other people, rather than inward, where it might actually belong. A person who cannot tolerate their own mistakes often becomes, without meaning to, someone who struggles to tolerate mistakes in others as well. Not because they are unkind by nature, but because someone else's visible imperfection threatens the fragile structure holding their own perfectionism in place. If mistakes are acceptable in you, the unconscious logic goes, then perhaps my relentless self-monitoring has been unnecessary all along. That is a threatening thought to a system built entirely around avoiding error, and so it gets defended against, often through irritability, criticism, or an exhausting need to control outcomes that were never fully controllable to begin with. Consider emotional avoidance more broadly. Some people learn, early and thoroughly, that feelings themselves are inconvenient. Not any single feeling, but the entire category. Emotion, in the environment they grew up in, was treated as something to manage, minimize, or work around, rather than something to experience and move through. These people often become remarkably good at logic, at problem solving, at staying calm under pressure that would overwhelm most people. These are real strengths, worth acknowledging as such. But underneath them is often a disconnection from an entire dimension of experience, one that does not simply go quiet because it has been avoided. It resurfaces physically, sometimes as tension, as fatigue, as a body that carries what the mind has refused to process. It resurfaces relationally, as a partner or friend who feels a persistent, hard-to-articulate distance, even in moments that should feel close. It resurfaces, eventually, in moments of unexpected intensity, when something finally breaks through the avoidance all at once, disproportionate and disorienting, because it was never allowed to move through in smaller, manageable amounts. Consider compulsive people-pleasing. This is perhaps one of the clearest examples of suppression masquerading as virtue. A person who has learned that their own preferences are dangerous, that disagreement risks rejection, that the safest path is always the one that keeps everyone else comfortable, will often develop an automatic, almost reflexive orientation toward accommodating others. This can look, and often is described as kindness. But there is a difference between kindness that flows from genuine generosity and accommodation that flows from fear. The first has room to say no, the second does not. And a person who cannot say no, who has never developed the internal permission to prioritize their own needs even occasionally, often ends up living a life quietly shaped by everyone except themselves, exhausted by a generosity that was never entirely a choice. There is one more phenomenon worth naming directly, because it tends to be the moment when suppression becomes impossible to ignore, even for a person who has spent years successfully looking away from it. The disproportionate reaction. You know the feeling. Something relatively small happens, a minor criticism, an offhand comment, a small inconvenience, and the response that comes out of you is entirely out of scale with what actually occurred. You snap at someone over something trivial. You feel tears rise over a comment that, said to someone else, would barely register. You find yourself consumed, for an entire afternoon, by an irritation that objectively should have dissolved within minutes. In the aftermath, There is often a familiar confusion. Why did that affect me so much? It wasn't even that big a deal. But disproportionate reactions are rarely actually about the immediate trigger. They tend to be about everything that trigger touched on its way in, all the smaller, similar moments that were suppressed rather than processed, each one adding a small amount of pressure to a reservoir that eventually, inevitably, exceeds its capacity. The trigger is simply the final drop, arriving after hundreds of others that were never allowed to be felt fully at the time they occurred. This reframes the disproportionate reaction into something more useful than shame. Instead of concluding that you overreacted and should simply try harder to control yourself next time, it becomes possible to ask a more productive question. What has been building quietly underneath this? What has this particular trigger been touching that has nothing to do with the size of the trigger itself, and everything to do with how much was already there before it arrived? Consider one more pattern, because it tends to be among the most difficult to recognize in yourself: chronic self-sufficiency. Some people move through life with an almost total unwillingness to ask for help in any form, under almost any circumstance. They will struggle silently through difficulties that would reasonably call for support rather than reach out. They will describe themselves, often with a note of quiet pride, as someone who has always had to figure things out alone, someone who simply does not lean on others the way other people seem to. This is frequently, though not always, a suppression rather than a genuine preference. Somewhere earlier in life, often in childhood, this person likely learned that asking for help was met with disappointment, unavailability, or a burden placed back onto them in return. And so, rather than continuing to ask and continuing to be met with insufficiency, they made a quieter, more permanent decision. They would simply stop needing anything from anyone as thoroughly as it is possible for a person to do. The needing did not disappear. It went underground, where it now expresses itself as a kind of chronic exhaustion that never quite makes sense given the actual workload involved, or as a persistent, low-level loneliness that coexists uneasily with a genuinely full social life, or as brief, startling moments of resentment toward people who seem to receive support easily, without the same effort this person has always had to expend to get by on their own. What makes this particular suppression so difficult to see is that self-sufficiency is genuinely admired in most cultures as a virtue. It rarely draws concern the way visible distress does. A person who never asks for anything is often praised for their strength, congratulated for their independence, held up as an example to others. The suppression hides in plain sight, disguised as a compliment. Recognizing this pattern in yourself, if it applies, does not mean concluding that independence itself is unhealthy or that needing nothing from anyone is always a sign of suppressed need. Some people genuinely do prefer significant autonomy, and there is nothing wrong with that preference when it is chosen freely. The relevant question, as with everything explored in this audiobook, is not whether the trait exists, but whether it was chosen or whether it was the only option that ever felt safe. What connects all of these patterns is not any single emotion or trait. It is the underlying mechanism. When something in you is denied a legitimate place in your conscious identity, it does not stop existing. It goes underground, and from underground, it continues to influence your thoughts, your reactions, your relationships, often more powerfully than it would if you had simply allowed it to exist in the open. This is, in some ways, the central paradox of suppression. The very act of denying a feeling, hoping to reduce its influence, tends instead to increase it, because a feeling that is acknowledged can be examined, understood, and consciously managed, while a feeling that is denied can only operate blindly, outside the reach of your judgment, your reasoning, your capacity to choose. It is worth being precise here, because this idea can easily be misunderstood in a direction that causes more harm than good. None of this is meant to suggest that every disproportionate reaction should be excused, or that suppressed emotion justifies harmful behavior. The goal here is not to provide a defense for cruelty or explosiveness, or the damage that unexamined emotion can cause in relationships. The goal is understanding, not justification. Recognizing that a sudden burst of anger came from years of suppressed frustration does not make the burst acceptable. It simply explains where it came from so that the pattern can eventually be interrupted, rather than repeated indefinitely under the assumption that it arrives from nowhere and cannot be examined. This distinction matters more than almost anything else in this audiobook. Understanding where a reaction comes from is not the same as excusing its consequences. You can recognize that your anger has deep roots and still take full responsibility for how you express it. You can understand that your people-pleasing developed as a survival strategy and still work to change the patterns it created. You can see clearly where your perfectionism came from and still choose, deliberately, to treat yourself and others with more patience than that perfectionism would otherwise allow. The purpose of looking closely at suppression is not to hand yourself an excuse. It is to take back a kind of authorship over patterns that have, until now, been operating largely without your awareness or consent. Because a suppressed emotion cannot be chosen, it can only be endured, denied, or released in moments you did not select, in ways you would not have selected either, had you actually been given the choice. An acknowledged emotion, even an uncomfortable one, opens up a different possibility entirely. Not elimination, not indulgence. Choice. And choice, more than almost anything else, is what separates a person who is controlled by their unconscious patterns from a person who has begun, slowly and imperfectly, to understand them. Quaff the courage to look at yourself. Everything discussed so far has been building toward a single, deceptively simple task. Not analysis for its own sake, not a theory to admire from a safe distance. A practice. The practice of turning your attention toward yourself with more honesty than usual and staying there long enough to actually see something. This is harder than it sounds, and it is worth being honest about why. Most people are not afraid of self-awareness in the abstract. Most people would say, if asked, that they value understanding themselves, that they want to grow, that they are open to reflection. The difficulty is not in the concept. The difficulty is in the specific moment when self-observation stops being comfortable and starts requiring you to look at something you would rather not see. It is one thing to reflect on your childhood in general terms. It is another thing entirely to sit with the specific memory of the exact words that taught you your anger was unacceptable, and to feel, even now, the old obedience rising in you as you try to look at it directly. It is one thing to acknowledge, abstractly, that everyone has flaws. It is another thing to notice, in real time, the exact sensation of jealousy moving through your body as a friend describes their success, and to resist the urge to immediately explain it away. This points towards something worth mentioning directly, because it is easy to overlook in a conversation that has, until now, stayed mostly in the territory of thoughts and stories. Much of what this audiobook has been describing announces itself first in the body, before it ever becomes a fully formed thought. A tightness in the jaw, a heat behind the eyes, a sinking sensation in the stomach that arrives a half-second before you consciously register what you are feeling. Learning to notice these physical signals, rather than only the thoughts that follow them, is often the fastest way into this kind of self-observation, because the body tends to register what the shadow contains before the mind has finished constructing a story to explain it away. Self-observation of the kind this audiobook is describing requires something specific, not intelligence, not even particularly rigorous introspection. It requires a willingness to stay present with discomfort for slightly longer than instinct wants you to. Here is a place to begin, not as a rigid method, but as a set of honest questions worth returning to, slowly, over time, rather than answering all at once. What repeatedly triggers you? Not what annoys you occasionally. in the ordinary way that minor frustrations annoy everyone. What triggers you consistently, reliably, in a way that feels slightly disproportionate to the situation itself? The comment that always gets under your skin, even when you tell yourself it shouldn't. The kind of person who reliably produces tension in you, even before they have done anything specific. These recurring triggers are rarely random. They tend to cluster around exactly the traits and feelings that have been pushed into your shadow, because those are the places where your defenses are thinnest, where an outside stimulus can reach something you have been holding closed. What you strongly judge. Not mild disapproval, but the judgments that carry real heat, the ones you feel almost righteous about. People who are lazy, people who are needy, people who show off, people who complain too much. Whatever your particular list looks like, it is worth asking honestly whether any of those traits exist somewhere in you as well, in a form you have not permitted yourself to acknowledge. Strong judgment often functions as a kind of psychological distancing, a way of drawing a hard line between yourself and a trait you fear might actually belong to you. What you refuse to admit. This one requires more patience than the others, because by definition, it resists direct examination. A useful approach is to notice the sentences you reach for automatically, the ones that begin with "I would never" or "I'm just not the type of person who." These declarations are worth treating with mild suspicion, not because they are necessarily false, but because the intensity with which they are stated sometimes reveals more than their content. People rarely feel the need to loudly insist they are not something that genuinely holds no pull for them at all. What you envy. Envy is one of the most reliable signals available, precisely because it is so uncomfortable to admit. Most people are far more willing to acknowledge anger, or sadness, or even fear, than they are willing to acknowledge envy. It carries a particular shame, a sense that wanting what someone else has says something unflattering about your own character. But envy, examined honestly rather than judged immediately, is an extraordinarily precise map. It points directly at what you want, and often at what you have decided you are not allowed to want. The friend whose freedom you envy is showing you a freedom you have not claimed. The colleague whose confidence you envy is showing you a confidence you have not developed. Envy, followed honestly, leads almost every time to a doorway back into your own shadow, what you secretly desire. Not necessarily anything scandalous, often something far more ordinary than the word secretly implies. To be praised more openly, to take up more space in a room, to rest without guilt, to say no without a lengthy justification attached, to be angry without immediately managing everyone else's reaction to your anger. These quiet, unspoken desires are worth naming to yourself honestly, even if you have no immediate plan to act on them, because naming them is the first step in reclaiming them as part of a complete picture of who you are. What you pretend not to care about. There is a particular tone people use when discussing something they claim indifference toward, a tone that, if you listen closely, often carries more charge than genuine indifference would produce. Genuine indifference is usually quiet. It does not need to be declared. If you find yourself repeatedly insisting that something doesn't matter to you, that you don't care what people think, that recognition means nothing to you. It is worth at least considering the possibility that the insistence itself is doing some work, covering for a need that feels too vulnerable to admit directly. What patterns keep repeating? This is perhaps the most practical entry point of all, because it does not require abstract introspection so much as simple observation over time. The same argument, recurring across different relationships, with different people, somehow always ending up in a familiar place. The same kind of person you keep encountering in friendships, in romantic relationships, in work environments, who triggers the same reaction each time. The same regret showing up again and again in slightly different clothing. Repeated patterns are rarely coincidences. They tend to indicate an unconscious dynamic playing out on a loop, one that will likely continue exactly as it has until it is finally brought into conscious awareness and examined directly. None of these questions are meant to be answered quickly, or all at once, or with the kind of tidy clarity that makes for a satisfying conclusion. They are meant to be carried with you, returned to gradually, allowed to surface their answers slowly, often in unexpected moments, long after you first considered them. It can help to walk through what this actually looks like in an ordinary moment, rather than only discussing it in the abstract. Imagine you are in a meeting and a colleague presents an idea, one that is met with visible enthusiasm from everyone in the room. You feel something tighten in your chest. Your first thought, arriving almost instantly, is that the idea isn't actually that strong, that people are overreacting, that you could have come up with something better if you had been given the chance to speak first. The ordinary response, the one that requires no courage at all, is to simply believe that first thought, to nod along outwardly while privately dismissing the idea, finding small flaws in it, waiting for an opportunity to point them out. This response feels justified in the moment. It does not feel like avoidance. It feels like accurate judgment. The harder response, the one this audiobook has been describing, involves a small pause before accepting that first thought is simply true. It involves asking, honestly and without immediate self-judgment, whether the discomfort in your chest is really about the quality of the idea, or whether it might be about something else entirely. Envy, perhaps. A quiet, uncomfortable wish that the enthusiasm in the room had been directed at you. This does not mean the idea was necessarily good or that your critique has no merit. It simply means separating the critique from the discomfort long enough to examine each honestly, rather than letting the discomfort masquerade as objective judgment. This same small pause can be applied almost anywhere. In the sting you feel when a friend cancels plans, before concluding they don't value you, ask whether an old fear of unimportance is doing some of that work. In the irritation you feel when a partner needs reassurance, before concluding they are simply too needy, ask whether their need is touching something in you that finds needing uncomfortable to witness, because it was never allowed to be witnessed in yourself. None of these pauses are comfortable. They ask you to hold open, for a few extra seconds, a question you would often rather close quickly with a familiar, comfortable answer. But it is precisely in that small, uncomfortable pause that the possibility of seeing yourself more clearly actually lives. There is a particular kind of courage required for this work, and it is worth naming clearly, because it is easy to underestimate. It is not the courage of a single, dramatic confrontation with yourself. It is a quieter, more sustained courage. The courage to notice a reaction and not immediately explain it away. The courage to sit with an uncomfortable realization for a few extra seconds before reaching for a story that makes it go away. The courage to ask, honestly, why does this bother me so much, instead of settling immediately for because they're wrong and I'm right. It helps, too, to understand what to actually do once one of these uncomfortable realizations surfaces, because insight alone, without any practice for what comes next, can leave a person feeling exposed without feeling any wiser. The first step is simply naming the feeling accurately, silently, without immediately following the name with a story about what it means about your character. Not, I am a jealous, petty person, but simply, this is jealousy, arriving right now in response to this specific situation. The naming itself tends to reduce the intensity slightly, because a feeling that has been identified is easier to hold than a feeling that remains formless and overwhelming. The second step is resisting the urge to immediately act on the feeling or immediately suppress it back into hiding. Both responses are understandable, and both bypass the actual work. Acting on jealousy might mean saying something cutting or quietly sabotaging, or withdrawing coldly from someone who has done nothing to deserve it. Suppressing it back down might mean pretending the feeling never surfaced at all, returning quickly to the comfortable story where you do not feel that way about anything. Between those two familiar options lies a third, less familiar one, simply staying with the feeling without needing to do anything about it immediately. The third step, and often the most valuable, is asking what the feeling is pointing toward once it has been allowed to exist without judgment for a moment. What does this jealousy want? What is it telling you about a desire you have not been honoring, or a comparison you have been making unconsciously, or a version of yourself you have quietly given up on becoming? The answer will not always arrive immediately. Sometimes it takes hours, or days, or a conversation with someone you trust before the shape of it becomes clear. That is fine. The goal is not instant resolution. The goal is simply staying curious for slightly longer than habit would normally allow. It is worth addressing directly a fear that often accompanies this kind of self-examination because it is common enough to deserve a direct response. Many people avoid looking closely at themselves because they fear what they might find. They imagine that beneath the acceptable version of themselves lies something genuinely monstrous, something that, once acknowledged, cannot be controlled. This fear, while understandable, tends to be based on a misunderstanding of what the shadow actually contains. Acknowledging a feeling is not the same as acting on it. You can recognize jealousy moving through you, name it honestly to yourself, and still choose, deliberately, not to act cruelly because of it. In fact, naming it tends to make cruel action less likely, not more, because the jealousy is no longer operating invisibly, shaping your behavior without your awareness. Once seen, it can be held at a slight distance. Once held at a distance, it can be chosen around, rather than obeyed automatically. You can recognize anger rising in you, acknowledge it fully, without becoming an angry person who lashes out at everyone nearby. Acknowledgement creates space between the feeling and the response, space that suppression, ironically, tends to eliminate. A suppressed anger, denied so long it finally erupts, has no space around it at all. It simply happens all at once, unmediated by any conscious choice. An acknowledged anger, felt clearly and named honestly, retains a kind of permeability. It can be expressed thoughtfully, or set aside deliberately, or channeled into something constructive, because it has been given room to exist as information rather than forced to exist only as pressure. This is, in many ways, the entire point of the courage being described here. You are not being asked to become someone who acts on every impulse, indulges every desire, or excuses every reaction because it has deep roots. You are being asked to become someone who can see clearly enough to choose deliberately, rather than react blindly to forces that have been operating outside your awareness for as long as you can remember. That distinction between acknowledgement and indulgence, between awareness and automatic action, is what separates genuine psychological growth from mere self-justification, and it is worth returning to, again and again, as this audiobook moves closer to what Jung considered the actual goal of all this difficult, honest self-examination. Not perfection, not the elimination of everything uncomfortable within you, something closer to wholeness. Firefly shadow integration. The word integration can sound, on first hearing, like something more dramatic than it actually is. It can conjure images of confrontation, of some decisive internal battle where the hidden parts of you are finally released, unleashed, given free rein after years of restraint. That is not what Jung meant by the term, and it is worth clearing up the misunderstanding directly, because getting this wrong can lead somewhere genuinely unhelpful. Integration does not mean giving every impulse permission to act. It does not mean becoming selfish because you have decided your suppressed desires deserve expression regardless of consequence. It does not mean abandoning the discipline, the kindness, the restraint you have spent years cultivating on the theory that anything unconscious must automatically be more authentic, more true, more worth honoring than anything conscious and deliberate. Integration means something more modest, and in a way, more difficult. It means becoming conscious of a wider range of what exists within you, so that your behavior can be chosen with full information, rather than driven, unconsciously, by only the parts of yourself you have agreed to acknowledge. Think of it less as a dramatic release, and more as an expansion of the room you have been living in. For most of your life, you have likely occupied only part of your own psychological house. The rooms that fit your persona. The rooms that received approval, that felt safe, that matched the story you tell about who you are. The other rooms, the ones containing your anger, your ambition, your need for attention, your vulnerability, whatever specific traits your particular history taught you to disown, have remained closed, sometimes for so long that you forgot they were part of the same house at all. Integration is the process of walking back into those rooms, not to move into them permanently, not to abandon the parts of the house you have grown to love, but simply to know the full shape of the place you actually live. This changes something important about how you experience yourself. A person who has not integrated their shadow tends to experience themselves as relatively simple, relatively consistent, a person defined by a fairly narrow set of qualities: calm, reasonable, generous, independent. And because this self-concept is narrow, anything that falls outside it tends to feel foreign, alarming, or shameful when it inevitably arises, as it always eventually does. A person who has done some of this integration work tends to experience themselves quite differently. Not as simpler, but as more complete, capable of calm, and also capable of anger, without either one threatening the stability of their identity. Reasonable, most of the time, and also capable of occasional unreasonableness, without needing to pretend otherwise. Generous, genuinely, and also aware of moments of self-interest, without needing to deny them in order to remain generous. This shift is not merely cosmetic. It tends to reduce a particular kind of exhausting internal labor that a narrow identity requires without you ever fully noticing the cost. Maintaining a self-image that excludes entire categories of ordinary human experience takes constant, low-level vigilance, a persistent monitoring of your own thoughts and reactions to ensure nothing slips out that would contradict the story. Integration relaxes that vigilance, not because standards disappear, but because there is simply less that needs guarding against. This is worth sitting with, because it points towards something that can initially feel paradoxical. You can be strong and vulnerable. Not strong most of the time, with vulnerability as an occasional, regrettable lapse. Genuinely both, simultaneously, as part of a coherent whole. Strength that has no access to vulnerability is not really strength. It is armor, rigid and brittle. Prone to cracking suddenly under pressure, it was never actually built to absorb. Strength that includes vulnerability, that can bend without breaking, that can acknowledge difficulty without collapsing, tends to be far more durable. Precisely because it does not require constant defense against anything that might contradict it. You can be ambitious and content. These are often treated as opposites, as though wanting more must always imply dissatisfaction with what you currently have. But a person who has integrated both can hold real ambition, real desire for growth and achievement, alongside a genuine appreciation for the present moment, without either one cancelling out the other. The ambition does not need to be denied in order to feel content. The contentment does not need to be abandoned in order to pursue something more. You can be independent and connected. Independence, taken to an extreme, often functions as a defense against the vulnerability of needing other people. But genuine independence, the kind that reflects real psychological maturity, does not require rejecting connection. It simply means that connection is chosen rather than desperately required for survival. A person who has integrated both can rely on others without shame and also stand alone without panic, because neither state threatens their sense of self. You can be confident and uncertain. Confidence that cannot tolerate any doubt is fragile confidence, easily shattered by the first genuine challenge. Confidence that has made room for uncertainty, that can say honestly, "I don't know," or "I might be wrong here," without feeling destabilized, tends to be far sturdier, because it was never built on the impossible foundation of always being right. You can be kind and capable of anger. Kindness that has no access to anger is not really a choice. It is compliance, often rooted in fear of what might happen if anger were allowed to exist. Kindness that coexists with the capacity for anger, that can set a firm boundary when necessary, that can say no clearly when the situation calls for it, tends to be more genuine, precisely because it comes from choice rather than from the absence of any alternative. You can be disciplined and spontaneous. A life governed entirely by discipline, with no room for spontaneity, tends to become brittle. A structure so rigid that any deviation feels like failure rather than simply variation. A life governed entirely by spontaneity, with no discipline at all, tends to struggle to sustain anything over time. A person who has integrated both can hold a plan firmly while still remaining capable of departing from it when something genuinely worthwhile presents itself, without treating the departure as a personal failing. Notice the pattern across each of these pairs. Integration does not ask you to choose one quality over its opposite. It asks you to hold both, honestly, as part of a more complete picture of who you actually are. There is a second, equally ordinary example worth holding alongside the first, because it approaches integration from a different angle. Picture someone who has built an identity entirely around emotional composure. They pride themselves on never losing their temper, on remaining level-headed in situations that would rattle most people, on being the calm presence others rely on during a crisis. For a long time, this composure serves them well. It earns trust. It makes them useful in difficult moments. But somewhere in the shadow of this person lies an anger that has never been permitted expression, an anger that accumulates quietly, year after year, disguised as patience, as understanding, as an unusually high tolerance for being treated poorly. Integration, for this person, does not mean becoming volatile or abandoning the genuine calm that has served them and the people around them so well. It means beginning to notice the difference between calm that comes from genuine equanimity and calm that comes from a refusal to acknowledge anger at all. It means learning gradually to recognize anger as it arises in its early, manageable form rather than only encountering it later, after years of accumulation, in a form too large to manage with any composure whatsoever. It means practicing small, honest expressions of frustration in low-stakes moments, saying that bothered me rather than swallowing it silently. It means allowing a raised voice, occasionally, without immediately following it with an apology for having a reaction at all. Over time, this does not erode the person's genuine capacity for calm. It makes that calm more honest, because it is no longer built on top of a growing reservoir of anger that was never permitted to exist. This can feel uncomfortable at first, because it complicates a self-concept that may have felt reassuringly simple for a long time. It is easier, in some ways, to think of yourself as simply calm, simply generous, simply strong. Complexity requires more effort to hold, more nuance to communicate, more patience with yourself when you inevitably display a quality that contradicts the simpler story. But the simpler story, however comfortable, tends to come at a cost. It requires constant, unconscious effort to maintain, effort spent denying, suppressing, and disowning anything that does not fit. And as explored earlier, that effort does not eliminate the disowned material. It simply pushes it underground, where it continues operating, unseen and unchosen. Integration, by contrast, requires a different kind of effort. Not the effort of maintaining a narrow identity, but the effort of tolerating complexity, of holding contradiction without needing to resolve it immediately into something simpler. This is, in Jung's view, closer to what psychological maturity actually looks like. Not the achievement of a perfectly consistent, uncomplicated self, but the capacity to hold a wide range of qualities, some of them in apparent tension with each other, without needing to deny any of them in order to feel whole. It can be useful to imagine what this looks like in practice, through a single, ordinary example, rather than only through abstract description. Picture someone who has spent years identifying almost entirely with helpfulness, being needed, being useful, being the person others can count on, has become so central to their sense of worth that saying no to a request feels less like a simple boundary and more like a small betrayal of who they believe themselves to be. Somewhere in the shadow of this person lives an unacknowledged selfishness, though that word carries more judgment than is actually warranted here. It might be better described as an unclaimed right to prioritize their own needs occasionally, without guilt, without immediately following the choice with an apology or an explanation. Integration, for this person, does not mean becoming suddenly selfish, abandoning the genuine generosity that has shaped much of their life and many of their relationships. It means something more precise. It means beginning to notice, honestly, the moments when helpfulness is actually a choice, made freely, and the moments when it is closer to compulsion, made out of fear of what might happen if they said no. It means practicing in small, low-stakes situations at first, the unfamiliar experience of prioritizing their own need without immediately following it with guilt. Declining an invitation simply because they are tired, without manufacturing an elaborate excuse. Asking for help with something, even something minor, and tolerating the discomfort of being on the receiving end for once. Over time, none of this eliminates the genuine generosity that made this person valuable to the people around them in the first place. It simply makes that generosity more sustainable, because it is no longer the only acceptable way for them to exist in relationship with others. The helpfulness becomes a choice again, rather than the entire structure holding their identity together. This is what integration tends to look like in an ordinary life. Not dramatic transformation, but small, repeated practices of allowing a previously excluded quality back into conscious awareness and gradually, carefully, giving it a legitimate place alongside everything else that was already there. It is worth being honest that this process does not happen quickly, and it does not happen once. Integration is not a single insight that permanently resolves the tension between your conscious identity and your shadow. It is an ongoing practice, one you return to repeatedly throughout your life, as new situations reveal new material that had previously gone unnoticed. There will be moments when you catch yourself reacting in a way that surprises you, and instead of immediately explaining it away, you pause and ask what that reaction might be revealing. There will be moments when you notice envy or irritation or a longing you had not expected, and instead of dismissing it, you sit with it long enough to understand what it might be pointing toward. Each of these moments, small as they may seem individually, contributes to a slow, cumulative process. Not a dramatic transformation, but a gradual widening of the house you live in, room by room, until less and less of yourself remains behind closed doors. This is what Jung meant, in part, by individuation. The lifelong process of becoming a more complete version of who you already are, not by adding something foreign to yourself, but by reclaiming what had been excluded, denied, or forgotten along the way. Individuation, understood this way, is not about becoming special or extraordinary or fundamentally different from who you have always been. It is about becoming fully yourself in a way that most people, most of the time, never quite manage, because most people spend their lives identified almost entirely with the persona, mistaking the acceptable version of themselves for the whole of who they are. Individuation simply asks for more. Not perfection, not the elimination of struggle, but a fuller, more honest relationship with everything that has always been part of you, whether or not it was ever given permission to show itself. It is not a destination you arrive at and then remain permanently. It is a direction you continue moving toward, one honest observation at a time. Far-Fei, when the shadow stops running your life, it is worth pausing here to ask a practical question. Not what does all of this mean in theory, but what actually changes in an ordinary life when a person begins doing this work seriously, over time. The changes tend to be gradual, and they rarely announce themselves as dramatically as the initial insight into the existence of the shadow might suggest. There is no single morning when you wake up transformed. Instead, there is a slow accumulation of small shifts, each one modest on its own, that together add up to a noticeably different way of moving through the world. It is tempting to imagine this kind of change as a single threshold crossed, a before and after, a version of you that finally sees clearly, standing in contrast to a version that once lived entirely in the dark. That is not really how it happens. Change of this kind tends to arrive unevenly, in fits and starts, with long stretches where nothing seems different at all, followed by a single ordinary moment where you notice, almost by surprise, that you responded to something in a way you would not have responded to a year earlier. The first shift tends to involve emotional awareness itself. Before this kind of work, emotions often arrive as a kind of weather, something that simply happens to you, unpredictable, occasionally overwhelming, difficult to trace back to any clear origin. You feel irritable, and you are not entirely sure why. You feel a wave of sadness at an unexpected moment, and you cannot immediately connect it to anything specific. You feel anxious in a particular relationship, without being able to name what exactly triggers it. As you become more familiar with your own shadow, this begins to change, not because your emotional life becomes simpler, but because it becomes more legible. You start to notice the connections that were previously invisible. That irritability, you begin to recognize, tends to appear specifically after conversations where you agreed to something you did not actually want to do. That unexpected sadness often follows moments where you witnessed someone else receiving a kind of open, unguarded affection you rarely allow yourself to ask for. That anxiety in a particular relationship traces back to a much older fear of disappointing someone whose approval once felt like a matter of survival. This growing legibility does not eliminate difficult emotions. It changes your relationship to them. Instead of being at the mercy of feelings you cannot explain, you begin to have a map, imperfect and always being revised, but genuinely useful, one that helps you understand where a reaction is likely coming from, even in the moment it is happening. The second shift tends to involve projection. As explored earlier, projection often operates invisibly, coloring your perception of other people with qualities that actually belong, at least in part, to disowned aspects of yourself. Over time, as you become more familiar with your own shadow, you begin to notice this process happening in real time, rather than only in retrospect. You feel a surge of irritation towards someone, and instead of immediately concluding that they are simply difficult, arrogant, or unreasonable, a quieter, more curious question arises alongside the irritation. What is it about this, specifically, that is affecting me so strongly? This does not mean every irritation gets second-guessed into non-existence, or that you no longer trust your own judgment about other people's behavior. It means the reflexive, automatic quality of the judgment softens slightly, replaced by a small pause, a moment of genuine curiosity before the conclusion is finalized. This shift tends to have a noticeable effect on relationships. People who project heavily, without awareness that they are doing so, often experience relationships as a series of frustrations with other people's flaws that seem to recur suspiciously often across many different individuals in ways that rarely implicate the observer. As projection softens, this pattern tends to soften with it. Not because other people suddenly become less flawed, but because your reactions to their flaws become more proportionate, less charged with material that was never really about them in the first place. The third shift involves the quality of your responses more generally. A person who has not examined their own shadow tends to respond to difficult situations somewhat automatically, drawing on patterns established long ago, often without much conscious input in the moment itself. The same defensive comment, the same withdrawal, the same over-explaining, the same conflict, avoidance, repeated across different situations because the underlying pattern was never actually chosen. It was simply inherited and has been running on autopilot ever since. As shadow material becomes more conscious, a gap begins to open up between stimulus and response. A gap that did not exist before, or that was so narrow it was barely noticeable. In that gap, something new becomes possible. Not a perfect response every time, not the elimination of old patterns entirely, but an increasing frequency of moments where, instead of reacting automatically, you notice the old pattern beginning to activate, and you choose deliberately to do something different. This is, in many ways, the practical payoff of everything discussed so far. Not perfect self-control, not the disappearance of difficult emotion, but a widening space in which choice becomes possible where it previously did not exist at all. This gap tends to show up first in small, almost unremarkable moments, easy to miss if you are not paying attention. A comment that would once have triggered an immediate, defensive reply instead produces a brief pause, and in that pause, a different, more measured response becomes available. A situation that would once have prompted automatic withdrawal instead allows for a moment of staying present, uncomfortable as that presence might be. These moments rarely feel dramatic while they are happening. Their significance tends to become clear only in retrospect, when you notice how differently a familiar situation unfolded this time. The fourth shift involves tolerance for complexity, both in yourself and in other people. A narrow, unintegrated identity tends to produce a narrow, somewhat rigid view of others as well. People become sorted, often unconsciously, into simplified categories, good or bad, safe or threatening, admirable or contemptible, with relatively little room for the contradictions that actually characterize most human beings. As you become more comfortable holding contradiction within yourself, strength alongside vulnerability, ambition alongside contentment, kindness alongside anger, you tend to become more capable of extending that same tolerance outward. Other people's contradictions become less threatening, less confusing, easier to hold without needing to resolve them into a single, simple verdict. This does not mean you lose your capacity for discernment or that you excuse genuinely harmful behavior because everyone contains contradictions. It means your perception of people, including yourself, becomes more accurate, less distorted by the need to keep everything sorted into simple categories. The fifth shift involves boundaries. This one can seem counterintuitive at first, because shadow work is often associated, in popular understanding, with softening, with increased compassion, with a gentler relationship to oneself and others. And while that is often true, it exists alongside something that looks quite different on the surface. People who do this work seriously often find themselves setting firmer boundaries than they did before, not fewer. This makes more sense once you consider where weak boundaries often come from. A person who has disowned their own anger, their own capacity to say no, their own right to prioritize their needs, often struggles to set boundaries precisely because doing so would require accessing exactly the qualities they have spent years suppressing. As those qualities become integrated, as anger becomes something that can be acknowledged and channeled rather than denied, saying no becomes considerably easier. Not because the person has become harsher, but because they finally have access to the psychological resources boundary setting actually requires. It is worth noting how this tends to unfold in practice, because it rarely looks like a dramatic confrontation. It looks smaller than that and more frequent, declining a request without an elaborate justification attached, ending a conversation that has become one-sided before resentment has a chance to build, naming a limit clearly, in the moment, rather than tolerating it silently and then withdrawing later, confused about why the relationship suddenly feels draining. Each of these small moments, repeated over time, tends to reshape relationships in a way that ultimately benefits both people, even when the boundary itself is initially met with some friction or surprise. The sixth shift involves relationships more broadly. Relationships built primarily around the persona, the acceptable, polished version of yourself, tend to have a particular quality. They can feel warm, pleasant, and functional, while also carrying a persistent, hard-to-articulate sense of distance, a feeling that you are known, but not entirely, that something essential remains hidden even from the people closest to you. As integration deepens, relationships often begin to shift as well. Not because you suddenly reveal every disowned trait to everyone around you, which would be neither wise nor necessary, but because the parts of yourself that do surface tend to surface with less shame, less defensiveness, less need to immediately explain or apologize for their presence. Vulnerability becomes something you can offer selectively to people who have earned it, rather than something you must guard against constantly, in every context, regardless of the actual risk involved. The seventh shift, and perhaps the most significant, involves your relationship to your own identity. Before this work, identity often functions like a structure that must be defended constantly against anything that threatens its consistency. Every contradiction, every uncomfortable feeling, every moment that does not match the story you tell about yourself becomes a small threat, something that must be explained away, denied, or suppressed in order to preserve the coherence of who you believe yourself to be. As integration progresses, identity begins to function differently. Less like a fortress that must be defended, and more like a living, evolving understanding that has room for contradiction, for growth, for the ongoing discovery of material you did not previously know was there. This tends to produce a particular kind of relief, one that is difficult to describe accurately until it has been experienced directly. The relief of no longer needing to maintain a perfect, seamless identity. The relief of being allowed to be complicated. There is an eighth shift worth naming, one that touches almost everything already described, because it concerns the tone of your own internal voice. Before this kind of work, the internal voice that responds to mistakes, to failures, to moments of falling short, is often harsh in a way that goes largely unquestioned. It simply feels like honesty, like accurate self-assessment, rather than what it frequently is, an inherited pattern, absorbed early from voices that once judged you the same way. This harshness often has a direct connection to disowned material. A person who cannot tolerate any evidence of their own inadequacy, who responds to a minor mistake with disproportionate self-criticism, is often, underneath that criticism, protecting against a much older fear, the fear of being fundamentally unacceptable, a fear that was likely never fully examined, only avoided through relentless self-monitoring. As shadow material becomes more conscious, this internal voice tends to soften, not because standards disappear, but because the fear driving the harshness loses some of its unconscious power once it has actually been seen. A mistake can be acknowledged, corrected where possible, and released, rather than used as evidence for a verdict about your entire worth as a person. This shift alone, achieved gradually and imperfectly, tends to change the texture of daily life more than almost anything else described in this audiobook, because that internal voice is present in nearly every waking moment, shaping mood and self-perception in ways that are easy to underestimate until they finally begin to change. None of these shifts happen all at once, and none of them happen permanently in the sense of being achieved once and never needing further attention. The shadow does not disappear simply because you have acknowledged its existence. New material continues to surface throughout a person's life. As circumstances change, as new relationships reveal new patterns, as old defenses are tested by situations they were never designed to handle. But the difference between a person who has never considered any of this And a person who has spent real time doing this work tends to be significant, even if it is difficult to measure precisely. Not the absence of difficulty, not a life free of anger, insecurity, envy, or fear. Something closer to a different relationship with all of it. Less controlled by what remains unexamined, more capable of meeting difficult emotion with curiosity rather than automatic denial. More whole, not because anything unwanted has been removed, but because less of what exists within has been left in the dark. 5. Closing. Nothing within you needs to remain a stranger. Return, for a moment, to where this audiobook began. The version of you that insists it is not angry, and then goes cold and sharp in the presence of one particular person. The version of you that insists it does not care what others think, and then replays a single sentence for days, trying to understand exactly what it meant. The version of you that insists it needs no one, and then feels a small, familiar unease when a message goes unanswered for longer than expected. These were never signs of dishonesty. They were signs of a house larger than the rooms you had been living in. Somewhere within you, there has always been a person you learned to deny. Not because that person is monstrous or shameful or dangerous in the way the word shadow might initially suggest, but simply because that person did not fit the story you needed to tell at a particular time, in a particular family, in a particular set of circumstances that shaped you long before you had any say in the matter. That person did not disappear when you stopped acknowledging them. They waited. They influenced the reactions you could not explain. They spoke, quietly and persistently, through the anger that seemed to come from nowhere, through the envy you were ashamed to admit, through the need for approval you insisted you did not have, through every pattern that kept repeating in different relationships, wearing different faces, until you finally recognized it as a pattern at all. None of this was ever really about becoming a different person. It was about becoming a more complete one. The invitation this audiobook has been offering, quietly, across every section, has never been to fix yourself, as though something were fundamentally broken and needed correcting. It has been an invitation to know yourself, fully, including the parts that do not fit neatly into the story you have been telling. This is not a comfortable process, and it was never going to be. Looking honestly at your own anger, your own envy, your own need to be seen, your own fear of being ordinary or unremarkable, requires a kind of courage that is easy to talk about and genuinely difficult to practice. There will be moments, even after hearing all of this, when you catch yourself reacting in a way you do not understand, and the old instinct will rise again, the urge to explain it away rather than look at it directly. That is not failure. That is simply how this work goes. Not a single insight that resolves everything permanently, but an ongoing willingness to keep turning toward yourself a little more honestly each time for as long as you continue living. Think, for a moment, about what it might mean to actually live this way. Not perfectly, not without setbacks, simply a little more honestly than before. It might mean noticing, the next time someone's confidence irritates you more than it should, that there is a question worth asking underneath the irritation, rather than a verdict worth delivering about them. It might mean noticing, the next time you insist too firmly that something doesn't matter to you, that the insistence itself might be worth a second look. It might mean allowing yourself, in some small, private moment, to admit a want you have been denying for years, not to act on it recklessly, but simply to know it is there, and to stop spending energy pretending otherwise. None of this requires an audience. None of it requires announcing your discoveries to anyone else. This is quiet work, done mostly in the space between one moment and the next, in the pause before a reaction, in the honesty you offer yourself when no one else is watching. What might change, gradually, is your relationship to that discomfort. You can see your anger without becoming your anger. You can feel it rise, name it honestly, and still choose how you respond, rather than being carried automatically into a reaction you did not select. You can see your insecurity without becoming insecure. You can acknowledge the doubt, the fear of not being enough, without allowing it to make every decision on your behalf. You can see your shadow without being consumed by it. You can walk into the rooms you have avoided, look around, and come back out again, more complete for having done so, rather than lost inside them. This is, in the end, what integration actually offers. Not the elimination of everything difficult within you, but a widening of what you are willing to know about yourself, and therefore a widening of what you are actually free to choose. There will be no single moment when this work is finished. That is not a discouraging thought. Even though it might sound like one at first, a house this large was never meant to be fully furnished in a single season. Some rooms will take years to walk into. Some you may only glimpse from the doorway for a long time before you feel ready to step inside. This is not failure. This is simply what it means to be a person with a genuine inner life, rather than a simplified story about one. Freedom, understood this way, was never about becoming a perfect, uncomplicated version of yourself, free of anger, free of envy, free of doubt, free of every trait that once felt unacceptable. It was always something quieter and something more attainable. Freedom is having less and less of yourself that you need to hide from. It is being able to sit with a difficult feeling without immediately needing to disown it. It is being able to notice a reaction that surprises you and greet it with curiosity instead of shame. It is being able to say, honestly, to yourself, if to no one else, that person I pretended not to be, that person is me too, and I no longer need to keep pretending otherwise. The person you have spent so long denying was never really your enemy. They were simply waiting for you to stop looking away. And perhaps, if you allow yourself to keep asking the questions this audiobook has raised, gently, without rushing toward easy answers, you will find that the parts of yourself you feared the most were never as threatening as the years of avoiding them made them seem. What part of yourself are you still pretending does not exist? Sit with that question, not tonight only, but in the weeks and months that follow. Whenever a reaction surprises you, whenever envy rises unexpectedly, whenever you feel yourself insisting, a little too firmly, that something does not matter to you at all. Somewhere in that noticing, quietly, without any dramatic announcement, the person you pretend not to be stops controlling you from the shadows, not because you have defeated them, because you have finally, honestly, let them come home.